Welcome to Rauta's original black metal from Finland, that is from the 90s series. This time we are gonna have 3 bands more from the 90s. That is, bands that were formed in the 90s. And since I've already gone through 7 episodes, meaning also 21 bands from the Finnish black metal scene, they're already the ones that started it, like, Impel Nazarene and Archcode, and of course Beherit, among others, and of course some of the bigger names, including but not limited to bands like Satanic Warmaster, Horna, and the like. Now, before we go to the so-called cult acts, the smaller, lesser, underground acts, lesser known, not lesser in quality, it's the final stop before we really go to the smaller ones. Now it's the last stop to talk about the somewhat bigger ones, actually the most successful ones. However, these are not purely black metal, but very much black metal related. So before we go into the depths, I think it's more than due time to talk about these big acts related to pagan black metal. That is the perfect time for be totally naked. No, I'm kidding here. I have pants on, but hey, let's do it without shirt on. After all, we're talking about pagans, Vikings, trolls. So let's go on about it. 3 bands from that scene. First, we'll go to Helsinki, the capital city, and we're going to talk about Moonsorrow, a band that started already in 1995. Back in the day, you might have seen this was a little bit late to the party, given that bands like, Version, Menslave, or whatever you had, Immortal, or, Dark Throne, and Mayhem for that matter, since the 80s, 1995 seemed late to the party. But 1995 was actually pretty early when it comes to Finnish black metal scene. There were only a handful of bands before 1995. We had pretty much the ones that I mentioned, the Beherits and Archcoats and Impel Nazarenes and the like, and not much else. So Moonsorrow was actually among Finnish black metal scene pretty early on in the game, and soon they started doing demos, demo after demo after demo, which resulted their debut album in 2001, which is along the lines of, the so-called golden era of activity for Finnish black metal bands. You can pretty much say the Finnish black metal started blooming between 98 2002 when it comes to the debut albums, and Moonsorrow is one of them. That resulted a rather quality work already when they started with the first album, Sudenuni, the sleep of the wolf, or wolf's sleep. Or dream also could be translation. The point here is they had honed their style with the demos, and when it was time to start with a full album, they were ready. They were not doing their early mistakes as so many given bands these days tend to do. They do the mistakes with first or even second album, and then only start honing up their stuff with the third one. But Moonsorrow was ready, just like a lot of other bands doing the same thing. And as such, they made pretty good of an album, but these early 2 albums especially, Voimasta kunniasta, which is of strength and honor. Nowadays, probably a lot of bands wouldn't really use that kind of a title. But these 2001 albums, they were so much more folky, not clearly, the epic black metal the band was later on to be known. Here it is labeled as folk/pagan/black metal. Sure, it, holds. But when we're talking about the early 2 albums especially, you will hear a lot of kind of a drinking song kind of stuff, clean singing, and lots of that folk part dominating the whole music. It's not exactly the kind of music that you would picture corpse paints on and spikes and all that stuff. So it was more about maybe a little bit more fun. But that led the band to move onwards, giving Kantaja 2 years later, Stone Bearer. And after that, Verisäkeet, which is like blood, not rhymes, but, roughly that direction. Not to mention the album 5, Hävitetty, Destroy, or Devastated, Annihilated. These happen in a very, very quick span. We're talking about less than 10 years, obviously, here. We're talking Merrill 6 years, 5 albums. And already the band was evolving with haste. It was taking big steps after 2 albums, and suddenly it became more of this epic and quite dramatic band, to be honest. And especially with the album number 5, which I've been told it was the hardest one probably for the composer or composers. It is so much more darker and bleaker than the early ones, which were once again more fun, more folky and all that stuff. You can almost take it like this. First they have the ale, the sausage, the party going on, By number 5, somebody has probably died. The ale is no more. It's gone. Probably, someone drank it. And there is no food. There is only fight. Or maybe there's just demolished town hall. Nobody's sober. People have passed out, left homes, whatever. Anyway, it's so much bleaker. So this evolution, this change was kind of happening very quickly. But it didn't happen like that overnight. Even though in hindsight, you might say 6 years, pretty quickly. But they had 5 albums. So each step made something different. And it was changing constantly, but slowly. So baby steps. With 5 steps, 5 albums, you get to see kind of a big of change. However, that being said, the change from Kivenkanta to the latest album, Jumalten Aika, to Time of Gods, isn't that big, even though there's 15 years of time difference. So basically what happened after Hävitetty, Varjona kuolleiden maassa, Shadows, we traveled to the land of the dead, or in the land of the dead, and Jumalten Aika, the changes were not that big. However, there's 4 years gap, however, Tulimyrsky between the Firestorm EP, and then another 5 years between these two. So yeah, the band has slowed down, and there's a variety of reasons. People getting older, people getting family, kids, all that stuff. And other bands, of course. But in my opinion, the band has kind of evolved into better things. I would say actually they peaked pretty much with Hävitetty and Tulimyrsky. But that is not to say that these latest 2 albums are like weaker. They just maybe don't have the same impact. But overall, pretty much you can say there's 2 eras for Moonsorrow. The early ones, the folkier ones, which is a little bit more goofy, a little bit too goofy for me, and the rest, which is known as more the epic era and all that stuff. And this is something that kind of put Finland on the map with the very Bathoresque, but still quite different, kind of epic black metal or epic pagan metal. And as such, an important chapter in the whole Finnish black metal history. A little bit different is Finntroll, which started 2 years later and eventually started having one of the key members in the band. As you can see here, Troll Horn, the main composer for Moonsorrow, is here also once one of the key members. And then you had a lot of other band members from various bands, but this wasn't started with these guys really. It was started more or less with, Somnium, Teemu. Great personality. I got to know him back in the days around the band was founded, because I remember he giving me the first demo, and this was roughly 97, might have been 98. And then these things started happening. The band lineup got already forced. So a couple of years later, when they made their first album, it was clear that this band has been once again honed. Now this time only 1 demo though. So the early Finntroll is not that big a step away from the early Moonsorrow stuff. Yes, very folky, very goofy, very much about having fun. However, unlike Moonsorrow, which changed their style after those 2 albums more or less, the band here has kept their style all in all. And they haven't been releasing albums that quickly. I mean, the early 2 albums almost back-to-back with 2 years difference. And another one's in 3 years later, 3 years later, 3 years later, 3 years later. Does that sound like a repetition? Sure, there was a pattern. Despite the lineup changes with vocalists and all that stuff, which have been changing. But then, after that, 7 years of difference, and now already 5 years has gone since their previous albums, which I think is the best Finntroll. They have already, all the time, made the style very, very, easy to notice, easy to understand, easy to spot. So whenever you hear a Finntroll song, you're like, okay, this gotta be Finntroll. They're probably copycats, but a lot of these bands actually probably own a lot of homage to bands like Finntroll or Moonsorrow for that matter. And while Moonsorrow definitely went for the more pagan stuff and more Bathory-like stuff, Finntroll kind of kept it very, very much. First of all, let's do it in Swedish, always Swedish lyrics more or less. And also, let's keep it that the folky pagan thing going on. So when it hears his blackened folk metal, not folkier black metal, as opposed to Moonsorrow's folk pagan black metal, there's a difference. This definitely is more folk metal, and as such you could say this doesn't really belong here. But I think it does, because it has its roots in black metal also. So, for example, the vocals and the vocal style that is. And some of the riffs are very, very much that. It's not that much of a step away from Moonsorrow anyway. Which leads us to the last band, Draugnim, which is something that I haven't really, been listening to prior to this one. This I actually stumbled upon by accident. when I was figuring out which would be the third band to fit this trio of Moonsorrow and Finntroll, and I was thinking, okay, there are some bands. I mean, if you look at it, you will see there are bands like Moonsorrow mentioned, of course, but Ensiferum is too much far away. And then you look at it, Turisas also. No, they are not really that much black metal. And we go list by list, and no, the same thing. If you go for Moonsorrow, you will see a lot of bands from the 90s, but a lot of them are not Finnish. So then you're like, what could really fit the bill? And there I stumbled upon this band, Draugnim, which is a Finnish band barely starting in the 90s. However, they pretty quickly did the demos and then they ceased to exist, only come back a few years later and doing albums. To be honest, this is a kind of obvious case of Moonsorrow worship band. The style is very, very same. However, here it's just black and pagan metal. So different, words being used and all that stuff, but a lot of relevance is the same. Throughout the 4 albums, which have been very, very later years, as opposed to their starting year, are actually very, very Moonsorrow kind. So epic, blackened, but more into pagan stuff, not so much folkier stuff. Very fitting for that matter. But I guess this is one of the bands went just kind of went under the radar, so to speak, because they ceased to exist early on when there would have been the push. So rather than doing an album after demos, they ceased to exist only to come back with a new demo. And then it started, as late as 2008. So definitely missing the first or second wave of Finnish black metal. But I guess this is worth mentioning because there is a similarity with Moonsorrow, even if it doesn't count fully as a 1990s band in the sense of doing albums and all. But these are somewhat bigger bands, especially Finntroll on Moonsorrow, that is. If you look at the numbers, social media followers, or whatever, how many gigs they have, they are the really big ones. So in case you want to go a little bit out of the typical boundaries when it comes to Finnish black metal history, Moonsorrow is the best place to start. Finntroll is okay as well, and Draugnim if you like Moonsorrow. So these are the bands you might go looking for, and links are provided in the description box. Next episode we will go for the smaller underground names, so let's see about that later in the summer. Off you go.